Hello, dear ones. Dzathor is my name, the lead organization development consultant with Strategy Dynamics Consults. Permit me to present to you the law of diminishing marginal guilt, an emerging disease in Ghana. Now, this law is derived from the economic concept or law, the law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility explains that the additional satisfaction that one derives from consuming successive units of a given commodity falls, declines, reduces, other things held constant. What this simply means is that if someone uses a given service or product for the very first time, the level of satisfaction that the person derives from that becomes very high. But then if the person uses the same product or service over and over again, the level of satisfaction, the excitement that the person gets falls. That's what we call the law of diminishing marginal utility. So permit me to demonstrate that with a graph for our better appreciation. So this graph is the marginal utility curve, and the vertical axis is representing utility, meaning the level of satisfaction that one is getting from consuming certain units of a given product. And then the horizontal axis is representing the units, that is the number of times the item or the service has been used or consumed, right? Now, so let's say you buy a house, you buy a car or a dress or a shoe the very first time. So let's use dress, for instance. If you buy a dress and then you wear that particular dress the very first time, the level of excitement, the level of joy and pleasure and satisfaction that you derive from that particular dress worn is very high. If that same dress is worn the second time, the level of excitement and satisfaction or the joy that you experience from wearing it the second time becomes moderate. Now, if that same dress is worn again or you put it on again, then the level of satisfaction that you get becomes low. And this is where sometimes you wouldn't want to wear that particular dress again. But then if you still wear it, then you don't feel any level of satisfaction. So now your marginal utility or your additional satisfaction for wearing it becomes zero, right? And this explains why we have a lot of new dresses that are not worn out, but we do not want to wear them. If you are compelled to wear them, then we begin to get what we call the negative marginal utility. So when a person gets to zero marginal utility, the person wouldn't continue to use the product ordinarily. So if you join all these plots together, then we get a negative slope for the marginal utility, demonstrating that there's a negative or inverse relationship between the satisfaction that you get and the number of times that you use a given product. So now we move on to the law of diminishing marginal guilt. Now, the law of diminishing marginal guilt explains that the level of additional guilt someone feels or a person feels for committing successive crimes over time declines or reduces or falls. What this means is that if you commit a crime the very first time, or if you do something bad the very first time, the level of guilt that you experience as a person is very, very high. But then if you commit that same crime over and over again, then the level of guilt reduces. Right, so let's use this diagram to demonstrate the law of diminishing marginal guilt. So on this diagram, we have the vertical axis, which is representing the number of guilt or the level of guilt that someone feels for committing a crime or a sin, so to speak. And then the horizontal axis is the number of times that particular crime has been committed. Okay, so what we're saying is that If someone commits a crime for the very first time, let's say a crime or a bad deed like stealing or using a vulgar word or taking a bribe or killing someone or committing adultery or fornicating, the level of guilt, the shame, okay, the level of remorse that you feel, the level of regret that you feel is so high, extremely high, such that sometimes you feel like going for confession, or some people who are Catholic will stop going for communion, or some even kill themselves for that strong sense of mental distress for committing that particular crime. Now, for such persons, if they commit that same crime again, the level of shame, the level of regret, the level of distress or remorse that is associated with committing the crime the second time, okay, becomes moderate. If that person continues to commit the same crime again, then the person gets low sense of guilt. If that person doesn't stop and continues with the same crime, the person gets zero guilt. And zero guilt, zero marginal guilt simply means the person doesn't feel any sense of regret, any sense of unhappiness associated with that particular crime or sin committed. The person does not feel any sense of shame or remorse or sorrow for committing that particular crime or sin. And at this stage, the person gets into what we call normalization of crime or sin. The behavior becomes normal to the person. And this is what urges the person on to commit even more of that crime. So if the person commits the crime again after getting to zero marginal guilt, then the person transits into what we call the negative marginal guilt. So if we join all these plots together, then we'll get the marginal guilt curve, which is also negatively sloping, meaning there is a negative relationship or inverse relationship between the level of guilt that we feel or the shame that we feel and the number of times we commit that same crime. So that is what we call the negative marginal guilt. The person even becomes happier for committing that particular guilt. Now, there are so many implications associated with a situation where the person gets into negative marginal guilt. So look at the implications. Anyone who gets into the level of negative marginal guilt begins to develop a depth sense of guilt. Now, depth sense of guilt simply has to do with a situation where the person does not feel shame. So the person becomes shameless, remorseless, no sorrow experience. The person's psyche or psychological makeup does not make the person experience any sense of distress or regret for committing that particular sin or crime. So the dead sense of guilt actually will also manifest in what we call dead conscience. And dead conscience is a total loss of sense of integrity, moral values, and then personal ethical standards, and then also principles. So such people with dead conscience do not have any moral, they lose all their sense of morality. They don't have any personal ethics or standard that govern their behavior at any given point in time. Now, when anyone gets to the level of dead conscience, then the person then transits into the display of sadistic behavior, meaning all those unpleasant things that a person does, that to him, he or she doesn't feel any shame. When people begin to suffer from their consequences, they don't feel any sense of remorse. That means that they even derive some level of pleasure seeing people suffer from their wrong deeds. They also lose their fellow feeling for individuals who are suffering as a result of their corrupt acts. And they also, worst of it all, they lose their sense of care for human beings or their fellow human beings. Now, these three, when it continues, then the person develops what I call integrity deficit disorder, which is a mental condition that causes people to lose all their sense of integrity. Total loss, absolute loss of integrity in that particular individual. And when people get to this level, they then do not care, doing things for their personal benefits, and it is they and they alone. Whatever happens to individuals, environment, or institutions as a result of their actions, they care less about that. So this is what I call the negative marginal guilt. We'll explore more of the integrity deficit disorder in my next video. Thank you very much for your attention.